So I'm going to show you some things that I call moves. They're the visible part, if you will, of what you do. It's the stuff you put into the prompts. But there are a bunch of what are called meta skills that really decide whether this is going to work. Move 0, I call it, is setting the stage. It's what's the frame for the problem? And what I'm really doing is I'm encouraging the language model to go off and pull in some relevant context relative to that comment or that question or that area of work. So it has a starting point. Because if I don't tell it to do that, it's just going to start with generics and maybe not have any kind of frame to work with and give you a really bland answer. Right? So set the stage is give the frame before the problem. If we look at the second move, which is to open broad, get the map, hold your details, I'll often withhold things that are details of what I'm looking for at first. Because I'm looking for it to expand. Again, it's diverge, converge. I'm looking for it to expand the set of possibilities. In case it turns up something that's really interesting that I hadn't thought of. And then, now this depends on I had to try to come up with sort of generic words for this. Add a signal. Add one thing you observed. So in the case of the fridge, it had this whole plan for how to do it. And I said, well, yeah, but how am I going to get the fridge out to put this thing in behind it? And it said, well, you didn't tell me about that before. Okay, here's what I'd recommend. You pull it out and you create a tail that goes up into the cabinet and leave it there for the rest of the project. Because I also hadn't told it I'm not going to do it all at once. I said, look, I'm not going to do this whole thing at once. I'm going to do it in pieces. And so it incrementally added the pieces to the plan to fit into the details that I added. Does that make sense? So you sort of end up with a different kind of an output when you work that way than if you say, hey, I know everything I want. Just do what I said. The next move, now this I've used much more with things like group dynamics and team dynamics and things like that, where you might be asking, how might I handle this kind of a thing or what's going on in this group? You have a general hypothesis. We're giving general stuff up to this point. And then you say, well, but at this point, Joe said blah, and that seems completely different than the thing that you were talking about in this conversation. What I'm really doing is challenging some of the context. Saying, okay, here's this countering thing, or here's this big slug of new information. How does that change things? One of the other moves is this idea of offering my read. And I never say, I think you're wrong to an AI system. Well, I have actually. I'll counter myself. Yes, there are times when it has spewed absolute nonsense and I've said, yeah, that's not real. And of course, then it either doubles down or apologizes for the next 5 minutes. But offering your read is, here's what I notice. What do you think? Treating it as a colleague. This is inviting analysis as opposed to correction. So then there's another move is test it. Find the data point that could break it. And so that's an example of what you did, Joe, right? Where we might get down a conversation and come up with something and it sounds good. But then I'll go mentally hunting for, okay, what's one way that I could throw a wrench in this? Even if it's only partly legitimate. And I'll say that again. What's a way I could throw a wrench in this, even if it's only partly legitimate? Sometimes the biggest cool surprises I've gotten back are when I've done that. Because then the system will churn an analysis of like, okay, what does it think of this kind of quasi-claim? And it'll notice something that I hadn't noticed about the previous stuff. So, what's a data point that could break it? Let the AI system sort it out. And then move 6, and this one is, I think, something that very few people do. Dan, this is sort of an answer to your point, is ask it to use outside world validation to prove or disprove the work. So, for example, some of the work, a lot of the work I do these days is around team dynamics, psychology, conflict resolution, things like that, right? There are a huge number of psychological models out there. And it's really easy to come up with some sort of nonsense claim about this is that. And there are occasions where, one of these systems has said, yeah, this clearly fits into that, blah, 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 and that causes this kind of problem. Well, my way of doing move 6 would be, or 6A would be, well, okay, so I'd like you to go out and check the academic literature and tell me which research is out there that supports and contradicts that conclusion. And if you started here and told it just go grab some stuff, like writing text, it's just going to go grab some statistically random pieces of stuff generally related to the topic. Whereas if you do it later on in the process here, it has all kinds of context on what are you actually interested in? What are we doing here? What kinds of things are really going to be relevant? And then the last move is the try to break it. And this is not me. This is, I'll go back to the AI system and say, hey, how could this be wrong? Can you disprove the conclusion we just came to? How would you try to disprove this conclusion if I asked you to? Stuff along those lines. And sometimes that pulls out some other really important information because it may pull some edge case stuff that's like, maybe this is not a fully mathematical based proof, but if you wanted to argue against it, this is a pretty persuasive argument.